full of danger, majesty, and mystery. But concealed in the midst of all things, at the heart of the lands between, another world lies unseen. Here, the darkest secrets of the past were shrouded in shadow, yet here we find the brightest mystery of them all. At the gates of divinity, the full power of the cosmos is on display, primordial forces able to create new realities. For most, they are an impenetrable mystery, but for those who really look, there are answers. Our quest for those answers will take us on a whistle-stop journey through ancient history as we pull apart all the inspired choices that fed into the gates of divinity, their purpose and their function. The main historical inspiration for Enir-Elim in general are the ancient Mesopotamians, and especially their religious practices. Mesopotamia is largely in what now is Iraq, and comprised a number of kingdoms such as the Akkadians, Sumerians, Assyrians and Babylonians, who between them invented the wheel, worked out agriculture, laid the foundations for mathematics and produced the first written language. The dusty ruins they left behind belie what a vibrant civilization this was. Religious cults varied from place to place, with each city having its own patron god, but all with a similar theology. Most importantly for us, they shared a vertical cosmology, gods in the heavens above, and the underworld deep within the earth. And so, to reach the gods, they built upwards. The holy temple around which any city worth the name was built was the ziggurat, a sort of artificial mountain which took the form of a step pyramid. The main structure was just a base, but at the top stood the shrines which housed the gods. Only high-ranking priests could enter to perform their rituals and offerings. Unfortunately, none of these shrines survive, and the structures of most ziggurats have been badly eroded or damaged. Consequently, there are large gaps in our knowledge of Mesopotamian religion, which is partly what makes this such an inspired choice in terms of gameplay. Without saying it outright, FromSoft have coded Enir-Elim and the Hornsent generally as being rooted in the unknowable mysteries of the ancient past. It helps that Akkadian is an early Semitic language, which is why Enir-Elim may have struck you as having either an Arabic or Hebrew about it. Again, it subtly suggests something foreign, ancient and mysteriously holy. Belurat is, at a glance, strongly evocative of a ziggurat, at least based on what we do know of them. It even resembles one structurally, with that imposing front and grand stairways. And of course, it serves the same function, namely to elevate the shrine. Enir-Elim is the mysterious temple complex where the world reaches up and touches divine heights. Even the name, as we saw in the etymology video, means bedchamber of God, and is drawn from the name of the ritual bedchamber of the all-important sky and earth gods that was once a shrine room. One noticeable difference is how the architecture becomes rounder and more delicate as the structure goes up. This is a temple built by the Hornsent culture whose crucible worship revolves around the forces of nature. Spirals and branches are the most sacred forms here. Not the heavy lines of real ziggurats, but natural lines, never straight, always aspiring upwards. That might be a little unfair, however. Mesopotamian ziggurats were probably loaded with greenery and trees at every stage. This is likely what the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon were. That particular ziggurat has been mentioned a lot in regards to Enir-Elim, in its allegorical form at least, as the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is a short parable in the book of Genesis concerning a large tower built up to heaven as a show of human strength. But God confounds the people in their speech and scatters them all over the earth. This is a not wholly serious account of how people came to inhabit the earth and speak different languages. But there's a moral there too, where adopting ideas literally above your station. It's saying, don't get delusions of grandeur and overreach to what only God can do. Good advice Mikola should have taken. Avalon is itself quite an important clue as to the nature of the Gate of Divinity, because although the earliest form of the name is ultimately of unknown derivation, it developed into Akkadian as Babilim, meaning Gate of God. Wherever historic mythologies include divine gifts like immortality being bestowed, it usually comes in the form of something to be drunk from a divine chalice. A gate, by contrast, makes for powerful imagery. We don't even need to be told outright how it functions, because it's crystal clear that passing through it leads one onto a new and transformed mode of being. That being said, we will come to look at all the evidence which does explain the mechanics more clearly. The name Belurat is also worth unpicking in a little more detail than we already did. My best, or at any rate most solid theory, is that it comes from the Latin word for "we will go to war." I think this works for a few reasons. There's a nice symmetry with nearby Castle Ences, also a warlike Latin name meaning sword. It fits lorically, since the Hornsent did in fact turn their best efforts towards going to war. And in common with a lot of other Elden Ring location names, it's a real word whose final English version shows telltale signs of having been localized via Japanese, down to the syllable. But by now, you must be wondering if it's not more obviously a play on ziggurat. That's a compelling idea when you consider that Belu is Akkadian for lord or ruler. However, this idea starts to fall apart a little when explored further. I previously reached out to an academic historian who studies comparative Semitic languages, and according to him at least, Belurat isn't a word you can legitimately create within the confines of Akkadian grammar. Now, I have to be careful what I say here. That doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't in fact how they came up with it, it just means I can't present it to you as a definitive explanation. I think it works on both levels. So far, we've looked at the Babylonian influence just on its own terms, but that influence is also evident from a very different perspective. Belurat might be an archetypical ziggurat, but I think a lot of what we see in Enir Elim has its roots in the Hebrew and early Christian scriptures. By that period of time, the Babylonians had ransacked Judah, destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and are consequently depicted as the enemy and enslavers of God's people. The Book of Revelation goes a step further and uses Babylon as a metaphor for the fallenness and vanity of the world. She is personified as a gaudy whore riding on the back of a beast. The kingdom of God, by contrast, is shown as the New Jerusalem, remade, gleaming and descending from the clouds. The city gates are open wide to all believers, and there is no more sun and moon because the light of God shines on her streets. You may not have noticed, but this is a characteristic that Enir Elim shares. No matter the time of day, it is always bright here. This is liminal space, illuminated by divinity, and the focal point of that divinity are the gleaming, pearly gates at the top of the tower. Up close, of course, it's a different story. The gates are less a conventional structure than a pile of bodies. We can even still see the ropes sticking out that hold it all together. It seems to have dried out or petrified somewhat since Marika was here, but make no mistake, there's still a lot of blood in this stone. That's very important, because the gate's function arises from its construction. As we discussed in the runes video, grace is visible in the eyes but suffused throughout the whole body. The so-called saints, who are in veneration of Shaman, seem to exude a faint golden glow, and of course at the other end of the spectrum, Marika and the Elden Beast are practically embodiments of gold. Even the concept of the tarnished supports the theory, because someone stripped or deprived of the grace of gold must implicitly have had or been meant to receive it in the first place. We are dealing here with the big, unspoken ground rules on which this in-game universe operates. Elden Ring functions on Brahmanic principles, in that everything comes from and is ultimately destined to return to oneness. Even the lowliest represent a tiny fragment of that divine primordial singularity, and though the gods and other emissaries possess a greater concentration, they too are subject to a higher, more ineffable power. I'll have a lot more to say about this in an upcoming video on FromSoft cosmologies, but for now we simply need to know that in the in-game world, it's demonstrably possible to harness the divine power of that oneness by gathering and manipulating its physical manifestation. The more you have of it, the more power you have available. I think there's something intuitive about what I believe is happening there. Just looking at the Gate of Divinity, it's hard not to think it works simply because it focuses or concentrates the collective power of the bodies which comprise it. FromSoft don't need to tell us that with item descriptions, because they've already shown it pretty explicitly. Having now established some historical context for the gate, we of course turn to what it was being used for. We went over this in some detail in the Dancing Line video, but we seem to be dealing with the natural endpoint of consent religious culture centred on the Crucible. This is a civilization which is sophisticated enough to appreciate the power they perceive in the world around them, but not quite advanced enough to know quite what it is they're meddling with. The Crucible was once the figurative melting pot when life was in its primordial stages. Over time, that power became diluted as more and more life forms came to flourish. Every individual life represents at once both a spark of that divine oneness and a further sign of its fracture. Everything we know about the Hornsent indicates that they were attempting to regain equity by artificially forcing life back together. Their efforts were primitive and crude, but they finally succeeded in the Gate of Divinity. They gathered enough of that divine power in one place, all that creative vitality, that they could infuse it into one person in such a concentration as to raise them up to the level of what passes for godhood in this universe. This is by no means the only way that powerful forces are able to operate, but it seems to be the only way open to lesser beings. And when a lowly mortal reaches the threshold of divinity, they undergo their apotheosis. Apotheosis, at least in the sense of what's happening with Marika and Mikola, is pretty rare in historical mythologies. The gods are gods precisely because their nature is spiritual and above that of mankind. Mortals becoming gods therefore just doesn't square very well with that. Apotheosis where it does occur is usually more in the sense of metaphorically honouring an individual, such as Greco-Roman cult heroes who occasionally rose to their respective pantheons, but never to the highest level like Olympians. Religions with their roots in the Buddhist tradition generally have scope for upward reincarnation into godhood, but they generally see godhood as itself yet another possible step towards an even higher goal, like moksha or nirvana. Deification may be rare in mythology, but at various points in history it has been a favourite artistic device to show the importance of a subject. This is always intended allegorically rather than literally saying that the person has become a god. For example, this fresco at Hampton Court Palace shows the apotheosis of Queen Anne. Anne holds a sword and scales to symbolise that she is a just ruler. Neptune and Britannia hold the crown above her head to exalt Britain's naval superiority during her reign. Likewise, in religious art, church ceilings of the Baroque were occasionally painted lavishly to show the apotheosis of various saints. Obviously, the point is that the person has gone to heaven and not that they themselves are on the same level as God. You'll notice a sort of directional difference though. In all these examples, it's the divine drawing upwards, whether classical gods allegorically honouring what someone represents, or the god of heaven rewarding his servants. But in Enerim, the effort is bottom up. Here, you can propel yourself into godhood. It's more like an assault on heaven. This is what the gate is capable of achieving, but it doesn't just work by simply walking through it. We know there is a ritual involved. FromSoft sidestepped the details by giving us a mostly indecipherable scroll, but Ansbach's dialogue offers us some insight, and we also have a few glimpses of Marika's ascension. There may be certain loopholes, but essentially sacrifices are required to elevate the new god, and they seem to require a consort. There doesn't seem to be any limitation on who or what can use the gate, so long as they follow the necessary ritual. The notion of Empyreans as solely able to become gods is likely little more than a self-serving fiction of the two fingers. The key point seems to lie less with the person who is to become a god, and more with the person who is supposed to usher them in. From what we can gather, their soul requires a new vessel, which implies that their current body first needs to be offered as a sacrifice. We also know from Ansbach that the physical vessel's soul is discarded in the process. That much squares with what we know about Radahn, Mohg, and what seems to be the case with Marika and who or whatever it is lying dead. As for why sacrifice is needed, perhaps this involves the transfer of spiritual energy from one person into another, or maintains the equilibrium of energy in the universe. At some level, the short answer is that the plot requires it. This isn't the first time we've seen this type of ascension to lordship depicted by FromSoft. Those of you who played Dark Souls 3 will recall that we are shown almost exactly the same thing play out more openly in our marriage to Anri. Spouses and heirs have always been important in terms of dynastic security and legitimacy, mostly for aristocratic families. Mythologically, pantheons of God are often loaded with stories of how they relate to and interact with each other. The gods of many early societies often represent physical things like the sun and moon or the sea, so those stories usually tell us a lot about how societies understood the relationships between the things they observed in the world around them. Dark Souls and Elden Ring rework all that into a mystical marriage. Our wedding to Anri is a wholly ritual affair which results in our taking her dark sigils, opening the path to become the Lord of Hollows. Elden Ring isn't really concerned with souls, but still, something vitally important is happening here on a metaphysical level which transforms one's essence. It's appropriate that a marriage of sorts is the key to that transformation. You'll recall that Eneralim means bedchamber of God, like in the old ziggurat shrines. This temple is where lordship is ritually, if not sexually, consummated into godhood. The closest we come to seeing that in action are these brief glimpses from the trailer, footage that launched 1,000 lore videos. I've prevaricated a bit on this, having initially thought it looks a bit like fabric, but it doesn't make much sense. I've now settled on the idea that this is the eye socket of some primeval or abyssal serpent. It makes sense from all angles. Gold is being removed from the sunken dead eye, where we know for a fact that the grace of gold actually resides. The loose skin is pallid and bloody, but it doesn't look like humanoid skin, and no sort of garment would be stitched with a hole like that in the middle, so it doesn't make sense for it to be fabric either. It also makes sense as a presumed serpentine being, since references are made to Placidusax's fled lord, and snakes seem to have been playing catch-up since. But there is one more reason why I think this, the main reason in fact, and it relates to the symbolism here. Marika already had a backstory, but this turning point is what I consider her big origin story, and I think there are heavy overtones of the most famous origin story there is, namely Adam and Eve, this being Miyazaki's twist on it. I hardly need to recount it, but briefly, the devil, in the form of a serpent, tempted Eve with the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She in turn gives Adam the fruit, and they are expelled from the Garden of Eden, from paradise. Knowledge is power, and power brings responsibility. Now that they know right from wrong, they bear full responsibility for their actions. They have lost their innocence. That was the original sin, and it passes down to all their metaphorical children, that is, all mankind. Given the Hornsent Brandon's dialogue, what we have here is an inverted form of the story, which involves Eve tempting the serpent. We are told of an affair and betrayal, and we hear Marika very colourfully described as a vile strumpet. I think the sexually charged language goes beyond metaphor in this instance, although perhaps not as far as to relate to Messmer's paternity. I suspect that the serpent was intended to become an incarnate god for the consent, and that Marika, the perfect shaman girl, was intended to be sacrificed as his consort. But, as we know, she had no intentions of acquiescing to that. She used her charms to rise to prominence, manipulated the light as only a clever shaman could, and ascended to godhood in the serpent's stead, taking herself for a spouse in the person of Radigan. It's such a perfect reversal of Adam and Eve's story, even down to the creation of Radigan. In the book of Genesis, God created Eve from one of Adam's ribs. Here, Radigan is created out of Marika, the masculine out of the feminine. Even a tree is there to complete the symbolism. Marika's own name looks like a clever reference in the light of all that, being one of many versions of Mary. There's a long theological book tradition of Mary as the second Eve, ushering in salvation where Eve ushered in sin. The betrayal was the original sin in this world, and accordingly it reverberated down Marika's lineage. The spiritual residue of the slain serpent clearly manifested in Messmer. After all, those snakes didn't come from nowhere. What Rani came to realise, whether or not she knew it started here, was that she had inherited the same conditions that had brought Marika to godhood. She could not achieve the same thing without making the same sacrifices, and so she set out to kill her brother. One body, another soul, and a consort. Mikola came to the same realization, but in an attempt to purge himself of the curse along the way, he divested himself of all that he was. Not only his flesh, but his mind and his heart. His vision was ultimately as hollow as he himself had become by the end. All of this raises two further questions in my mind. The first is the symbolism of snakes in the base game. Snakes are actively denigrated as enemies of the Erdtree, but we see little evidence that they actually are. We see little evidence of them at all, for that matter. Rykard turned on the Golden Order and made himself one with the Abyssal Serpent with the aim of devouring the gods. But those blasphemous intentions were wholly his own, and the Abyssal Serpent doesn't seem to have been doing much at that point before he involved himself. Blasphemy is, of course, a theologically loaded word, but it makes sense that out of all of the unspeakably awful things going on in the story, becoming one with the Abyssal Serpent should be uniquely sinful, at least from a Golden Order perspective. I wonder if, at the end of it all, snakes are simply an embarrassing reminder of Marika's sordid past. The other thing that occurred to me is that we may have misjudged Marika's motivation in shattering the Elden Ring. Up till now, I think we've taken it for granted that she did it out of grief for Godwin, but the right of the gate adds some important context to her decision. Marika knew exactly what was involved in attaining godhood on one's own terms, and she saw that Rani was coming alarmingly close. It doesn't make a great deal of sense for Marika to have shattered the Elden Ring just because of Godwin's death, because it only weakens her position. In the context of what we now know, it looks more like a desperate gamble to thwart those efforts and maintain her order, and to an extent it worked, although not exactly as she had planned. The player character ultimately wins out, but in truth her world had already started to unravel. Back when Marika walked through the gates, she was exiting her old life as much as entering a new one, but the seeds of her undoing were already sown in her making. Mikola tried so hard to distance himself from her mistakes that he ended up repeating them. Through it all, the gates stand there so impassively, waiting till the next person decides to make themselves a god. They should be careful what they wish for. Who knows, perhaps when the next tyrannical Elden Lord aspires to godhood, the gates will lead us into the next chapter of Elden Ring. My own feelings about the Gates of Divinity changed a few times as I made this video. This subject was one of the burning mysteries which I knew I wanted to tackle as soon as I finished playing, so I came to this with a kind of impatient eagerness, having initially felt a bit frustrated that after teasing us with all these grand revelations in the trailer, that they didn't ultimately give us just a little bit more red meat than they did. I have to be fair to FromSoft, we learned a lot about Marika's backstory and motivation, and those are the salient points in the story they're actually trying to tell. As a lore community, we do need to be mindful of getting too caught up in the side details. Focusing too much on minor points leaves us liable to, so to speak, miss the picture for the frame. Still, this is a significant world-building element, and a few more crumbs of information could hardly have spoiled anything. It would have made for a more satisfying, or at any rate less frustrating, ending. That said, I'm beginning to doubt even myself on that point. It's often been noted that amongst the many references to Berserk made in Elden Ring, Miquella has a lot of similarities to Griffith, who undergoes a similar transformation. The precise nature of it is different enough for us to disregard it as a like-for-like comparison, but the point I want to make is that the process is described in very explicit detail. Having read through that, I was surprised by how underwhelming it was to have everything laid out so clearly. In fact, it demonstrated some of the worst traits of fantasy writing. As a fiction trope, it's nearly impossible to describe the mechanics of divine mysteries without bordering the ridiculous. Not knowing how things work is, in most instances, more tantalizing and fun than knowing could possibly be satisfying. We've now peeled back enough of the mystery that I no longer feel actively frustrated, but I also feel like any additional explanations might start to detract from the enjoyment. And so, there it is. The Gate of Divinity, explained at least in broad terms. We know more or less what it does. We don't know exactly how, but perhaps we're better off not knowing too much. The gates stand there so proudly, opening out to the heavens. But to us, they must remain closed.